My presentation is about downloadable content and is it good or is it pure evil? Because it's evil. It's not.
Thank you, Steph. Murtagh.
The history of DLC in the early 90s, the Atari had a game line service. You could download games to a cartridge over your phone line. And then in '94, Sega launched the Sega Channel, but they were full titles that you could download and not DLC. But it's kind of where it all started. Then through the 90s, consoles really didn't have downloadable content. It was all PC gaming, mainly driven by online communities with mods, skins, etc. And then Cave Dog and the Total Annihilation series in 1997, he released new DLC every month. It was kind of the first time anybody did that for a game. And then the Sega Dreamcast, first console with networking capabilities. There was DLC, but because the memory on the console was so small, it was usually terrible. And then Xbox Live brought broadband and the storage space of a hard disk to a console, and then DLC kind of got legs. They also introduced the Microsoft Point system, which meant that poor people such as ourselves who didn't have credit cards could avail of these online things. And then everybody else opened up their online shop, and the rest is history. So DLC, at the end of the day, it's a product. It's something that they can make money off. Game designers, game companies. So it started with expansion packs, but they were really overpriced and kind of a bad content ratio going on, where you pay 20 quid on top of the original game that you bought, but you got really nothing for that 20 quid. And then online social gaming, Facebook and microtransactions kind of changed everything again, where you had 49-cent transactions and you could buy, you're not paying 20 quid for a whole product, you can just buy the little bit that you want. And then you've different types of DLCs. So you've got season passes, which kind of give you a load of stuff for one price. LA Noire was the first game to do it. They had a pack, a bundle for like 20 quid, where it was a tenner, but you got 20 quid worth of DLC. But the DLC wasn't released when you bought the season pass. There's pay-to-win consumables, which are terrible. But this guy, Peter Molyneux, he had a game called Curiosity, which had, it was basically a game in a virtual room, and he played with loads of other people, and there was a black cube, and he hit the cube. And if you hit it with your hand, it did 1 damage. You could buy an iron hammer, and it was like 10 times the damage. But you could buy a diamond pickaxe. It cost 50 grand in real money, but it pretty much guaranteed that you won the game every time. But no one ever bought it. So, costumes. Costumes and skins. There's day one DLC, which can be things that weren't ready to ship with the game, but were ready when the game was released. And in my opinion, as long as it's free, day one DLC is fine. But if you're charging for day one DLC, you can disc-loaded content, which is like the mother of all evils with DLC. If you're charging people for something that's on the disc, you're evil. And then there's actual expansion packs, which is where it all started. So the motivating force for downloadable content is money. Good Lord. Games, when you have the disc, you can trade it into GameStop. You can trade it for another game. DLC is locked to your account, so you can't trade in your DLC once your money is gone. It's gone. Guitar Hero and Rock Band made massive monies from that model. Aerosmith made more money from Guitar Hero than they did out of all of the music that they ever released and made money from. And if you were to buy all the DLC available for Rock Band, it's like $9,150 for all of the songs. Season passes are like pre-ordering downloadable content that doesn't exist yet. You're paying money for an afterthought of a game that they haven't made yet, but that's fair enough, it can be good. And then free downloadable content still generates huge revenue for games companies and publishers, because when you go to download the DLC, you're exposed to ads, and they make money from that. And then Microsoft requires developers to charge for DLC, even if they don't want to, just as a rule, because they still want their 15%, and the 15% of nothing is nothing. DLC can be really, really bad. And kind of the only examples I could find came from Capcom, or the worst ones. The two worst ones were Azura's Wrath. Chapter 1 to 18 was on the disc. You could download chapter 19 to 22, and that had the actual end of the game on it. So we bought an incomplete game, and then we're expected to buy the ending. And then Capcom again were charging for DLC for the Street Fighter game, and then they discovered that all the DLC was on the disc, on the physical disc. It was just behind a paywall, so everybody kind of lost their minds. And it can be good as well. The Last of Us Left Behind expansion pack is a really good example, because the game itself was grand on its own, but then it gave this expansion pack which gave you the backstory of Ellie. And the game didn't need it, but it was like a nice addition to it. And with Fallout 3, they had 5 DLCs, but the Broken Steel one allowed you to play, like to continue on after the game was finished, and you could get your level up to 30, so you could just get insanely powerful. And that was kind of the one that fans liked the most. So what can we learn from all this about DLC? I made up the 6 commandments of DLC. How can you, like, if you follow these rules and you want to release DLC with a game, I don't think you'll go wrong. Do not forsake the development or developing any game ever for DLC. Just don't do it. DLC should not be content that's withheld from the main game. It makes sense, but people still do it. It should be actual extra content to the game, not just skins and color schemes. It should be released a few months after the main game is released, if you intend on charging for it. If it's free and you release it on the first day, that's grand. But you can't ask people to pay 60 quid for a game, and then the day that they buy it go, well, if you've another 20 quid, you've got a really cool thing that's there. The DLC should have a price to content ratio that's fair in the eyes of the player. So if you buy a game, a full game at 60 quid, and you get 30 hours of gameplay, if they ask you to pay 20 quid for DLC, you should expect around 10-ish hours of gameplay, thereabouts, so you don't feel like you're ripped off. And then the last one, the main game should exist as a whole unit by itself, and there shouldn't be any references to DLC in the main game while you're playing it. And that's it. That's kind of what I thought about DLC.
Steph, Murtagh, if you had to prioritise your 6 commandments, what would be number 1?
This one.
Yeah?
Yeah. I left it for last, so you know, you'll remember. Yeah, I think that kind of makes sense. If you're going to make a game, you should plan to make the game and then think about the DLC, not while you're making the game go, okay, so if we do this, but we have some DLC there, but it's not part of the game, you're just ripping people off. It's money making. That's all it really is.
Yeah. And we're reading that the DLC is effect of that the price we pay in stores today doesn't represent the amount of money and time spent on making the games, especially AAA titles where hundreds of people work for maybe years to develop games like GTA and Fallout. And without the DLC, it would be too great a risk for the developers to make a game, and they need this extra income to actually make profit and to make it worth developing games.
I wouldn't have any sympathy for like AAA games who are saying that they're not making enough money because they make huge amounts of money not just from the game but from merchandising and things like that. So there's no boo-hoo shortage of cash for them. But for small games, indie games, like they would rely on DLC. But I think they're a lot more ethical in the way that they implement their DLC, so people don't mind paying for it. You know, if it's a decent product, you're not going to regret handing over your cash. But if it's a AAA game and you hand over money and it's kind of mediocre DLC, you'd expect an awful lot more from them because they have the manpower behind it to make it good. And they have marketing teams and, you know, people who should make it work, so there's no reason for it to be terrible.
Yeah.
Just on kind of the topic of day one DLC, there is actually kind of a legitimate reason why a lot of games do have day one DLC, because there is a period of time between the game being finished and the game being sent off for certification when they can't be working on the game,
Yeah.
and you've got all these developers sitting around.
Like,
So some companies would get them to develop DLC, and then there's another reason as well why you'd release the DLC on day one, because a lot of times when DLC is released, if you wait until after launch, a lot of people won't actually boot up the game again just because they've heard of new DLC. So that
I understand that, like, the game gets shipped, everything is packaged off, but something isn't finished or something has been developed in the meantime.
Yeah.
But if you're charging money for it on the day one,
Well,
like somebody buys the game.
here's the thing though, because you have all these developers working on it. Do you expect them to work for free?
Well, they get paid a salary regardless. It's not like
But do
they're
you
working by
expect
the
the
hour.
company to pay that salary?
Yeah,
for-
but you can
Well,
also
where
look
are
at
they
it
going
from
to
the
make
point
that
when
salary?
somebody releases a game and they have DLC, they can use it as a selling point to get more people to buy the game in the first place, as opposed to just trying to shaft money from people who already gave them money.
I agree.
You know, like there's different, like that's my
There
essay
is
is going to
kind
be
of two
on this, and
perspectives to
I'm
this.
investigating into it. This is kind of just the surface, but the actual, I don't know, I don't know.
There are parallels between the business model that you mentioned there and monthly subscriptions like World of Warcraft.
Yeah.
What's that? What's the attraction in that business model? That's DLC and all, to all intents and purposes.
It's kind of, I don't know, game subscription services are sort of different. They're more of like a distribution as opposed to like a distribution service as opposed to downloadable content. So that's just the medium that you get your game from. If you have something every month, kind of like that Total Annihilation thing. That was, it was like another level. It wasn't really DLC because it was too early for it. Nobody knew what DLC was. So, I don't know, with subscriptions, it's more of a distribution thing as opposed to buying a game and downloading extra content for it. That's what I think anyway.
Okay.
Just one thing to consider, I think you should consider, is often the people who are defending DLC will throw down the defense that if this DLC wasn't like paid DLC, it wouldn't get made in the first place. So I think that is something you should bear in mind if you're going to be.
Yeah.
So it'd be something you address.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay. Well, that's